Hi, I'm Judith Dreyer. Thank you for joining me for this podcast series, At the Garden State Presents, The Holistic Nature of Us. My intent is to take us, you and I, into a better understanding of the concepts behind our holistic nature and how that ties directly to the holistic nature of the world around us. How can we connect the dots in practical ways that we are nature and nature is in us? I will be featuring authors and educators, practitioners, and others whose passion for this earth helps us create bridges. We'll see what's trending, what's relevant to our world today, not just for land use, but to connect the dots between ourselves and nature. It is time for practical action and for profound inner change so our natural world is valued once again.
Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Robert Radin, a fellow author and scientist. Bob's book, Spasm, a sci-fi environmental thriller, intrigued me. I follow the GMO issue, which he touches upon in this book, and I'm deeply concerned by the chemicals and genetic engineering used in our seeds and crops and what the future ramifications could be for our health and the planet itself.
So without further ado, let me introduce Bob Radin, author of Spasm. Hi, Bob. How are you today?
I'm doing fine, Judith. How are you?
Good. Well, it's a delight to have you here as part of this podcast series because we're going to be talking about holism and a holistic approach from a very different angle. So let's talk about you and your story, Spasm. Tell me more about it.
Okay. Well, first of all, in terms of context of the story, I am trying to get across the need for people to understand the environment, respect it, and that'll all come out as we talk. But I wanted to make a point because thinking of the climate change debate and how frustrating it can be at times when people seem not to listen. And it just seems that some people can be convinced by facts and documentaries and reason, but other folks can seem unpersuaded by those methods, particularly in this era of what we call fake news. But they may be moved by direct appeal to their emotions through drama and fiction. So I hope that Spasm, being a dramatic, it's a sci-fi thriller of unintended consequences, that as a novel and hopefully as a movie, may motivate some of those people to reconsider the consequences, intended and unintended, of the choices we all make and the actions we take in our relationship with the natural world, frankly, on which we depend for our survival as a species. So with that,
I don't think. Yes, I'd love to hear more about it. Go ahead.
Well, Spasm, as I said, it's a sci-fi and it's an environmental thriller. It's a mystery novel with suspense and surprise. These are the basic story elements, and I want to get that across in the beginning so people have some reference to what we're talking about. So the story elements are genetic engineering of plants gone awry that corrupts the food supply, invades the human genome, and threatens extinction of the human species. In the story, mothers grieve over infants who are dying from mysterious illnesses that have never before been seen by medical science. There's an unusual love story. There's famine. There's human cannibalism. Human cannibalism appears imminent. So here's an overview from the back cover. It's very brief, and this is it. It says, plants have stopped producing nutrients because the photosynthesis process in the plants has ceased. The food supply is collapsing. A small group of scientists led by plant geneticist Dr. Bill Harrison race the clock to rejuvenate the world's dying food chain. But something goes horribly wrong, an unintended consequence worse than starvation. Feeling remorse for his involvement in the catastrophe, Bill redoubles his resolve to save humanity from a gruesome fate. But time is running out as he confronts a mysterious, elusive, powerfully intelligent force that seems to thwart his every move. So will the human species survive, or is it game over? So that's the basics.
Well, to my listeners, I have read the book, and it's a very, very interesting way of presenting a possible dilemma, playing it forward just to give a scientific kind of approach to what could happen if this and this occurs. Bob, you've told me that Spasm explores three main themes. What are those themes?
So one of the first theme, not in any order, but one of the themes is the interdependence that we have with the natural world, our symbiotic relationship with plants. And I like to quote Chief Sealth, or Chief Seattle. The city Seattle is named after this Native American chief. And what he says is, whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. What he does to the web, he does to himself. That's attributed to Chief Sealth. So that's the symbiotic interdependence that we have with the natural world. The second major theme is the law of unintended consequences with science and technology, but more broadly. And so here I quote Professor Mark Stoller, who shows outlines the law of unintended consequences, very succinctly. And he says this: consequences from human actions often differ sharply from motivations of those who acted. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. Consequences from human actions often differ sharply from motivations of those who acted. And then the third question is this: is there some kind of superintelligence within nature, in plants, and in us? If there is, do we have free will in the presence of such a powerful force? So those are the three themes.
Those are very, I would say, deep structural components of the story. And I think you do, with your characters and your story progress, you really do touch upon all of those, which, again, I found very intriguing when I read the book. For myself, I don't think we stress enough our symbiotic relationship with plants. And in today's world, unintended consequences are hardly discussed because we're so eager to have the next this, the next that. And then the last question that I like to ask, especially to my classes and the places that I speak, is there is an intelligence in nature, and what does that mean for us? I don't think we've ever had a broad or even a personal discussion in a major way about that. Do you agree?
Oh, I completely agree. Yes, I do. Mm-hmm.
So let's take them one at a time. Could you kind of elaborate on those a little bit to give the readers a sense of the depth of your story?
Sure. So let's start with our independence with the environment. And these are just sort of lessons to start with. If we respect and we nurture the natural world, it will support our life and we will thrive. But if we abuse and sufficiently damage the natural world, we eventually will perish. If we reverse our destructive behaviors quickly enough, that's important, quickly enough. We're racing, the clock in some areas, like climate change. But if we reverse our destructive behaviors quickly enough and become good stewards of the environment, we may still be able to preserve our own life. And I'd say we're at such a crossroads now. So will we choose life? It remains to be seen.
Well, we have evolved over time, and we have evolved over the natural world, but sometimes I think nature's smarter than we are as a human species. I'd like to think that we get to some point in our development where we do become good stewards of the environment. And again, the only way we get that across is through education, and probably starting with the younger grades, so that children understand what it means to be good stewards of the environment, and then they become the adults who understand that very concept, and it becomes part of their nature. There's wonderful school systems around the country who are growing their own vegetables and lettuces and fruit for their cafeteria. So the kids are getting something in areas in our country, but I don't know if it's enough, and that's the question we always ask. Is it enough? So we have developed a symbiosis with plants. Could you tell us more about that?
It's actually, our relationship with plants, is a symbiosis. Plants and animals, including humans, we each provide the other what is needed to survive. We can't survive alone. We need each other. So here's how it works. Plants perform photosynthesis, and only plants can do that. Animals cannot. And what they do is they breathe in carbon dioxide and water vapor, and they use the sun's energy to rearrange and ram those molecules together, and they produce sugar, other nutrients, but main point is they produce sugar and breathe out oxygen. Then humans and animals in general breathe in the oxygen, eat the sugar, and breathe out the oxygen that plants provide. We use the sugar to create a molecule called ATP. It's in every one of our cells, and it's needed for life. Without that, we die. It's simple as that. And then we breathe out carbon dioxide that the plants in turn take in, and so on. It's an endless symbiotic cycle. So that's how it works.
Well, that to me is pretty amazing relationship.
Judith, may I just say, I forgot to say one thing. I'd like to, in terms of these symbiotic relationships and coming to your issue of children, I recently was watching a PBS Spirit television thing, and it talked about a symbiotic relationship with giant sequoias, and it's really quick, and I want to mention it. The giant sequoia trees are about 300 feet tall, 30 feet in diameter. They're the largest trees on the planet. But they have very shallow roots. That's what they lack. They lack a deep root system. They're only about 3 feet deep. I've seen oak trees, giant 100-year-old oak trees, blown over in hurricanes because once the roots get soaked and the roots get into the soil gets muddy and the roots aren't deep enough, the trees fall over. And that's the situation with the sequoias. They only have 3 foot deep roots, but here's the symbiosis between them. The roots are interconnected. The roots from different sequoias are interconnected with each other and entwined, so that if one tree is hit by a large wind blast or something, it doesn't rely just on its own roots, but it relies on the roots of the collective, and it doesn't blow over. In addition to that, there is a fungus which acts to facilitate the intertwining of the roots. And the fungus has a lack itself because fungus cannot do photosynthesis, and they have to rely on organic matter to survive. But what the sequoias do is they feed sugar to the fungus, so it's a beautiful symbiosis. So just wanted to mention that.
Oh, that's a great example of how the symbiotic relationship works, not just from the oxygen carbon dioxide model, but also what goes on underneath the ground, which I find really fascinating. That there's this huge network of facilitators. They share nutrients underground. I don't think nature is set up to annihilate itself. And from what I've studied in other medical models that are based on nature, we begin to see that everything that happens in the outside world happens in the inside world. And that leads us to understand that there's an interconnection. So that's a great example. What about the second theme in ecospasm, the law of unintended consequences? Can you give us a couple examples?
It is so big. It's so big an issue in everything in life. First of all, in ecospasm itself, the story, it's in there as a very important theme. So the plants have ceased performing photosynthesis, as I mentioned, and they stop producing sugar. And the scientists believe, now this story takes place in the year 2104, it's about 85 years from now, so our technology will be way advanced compared to now. But the science believe that centuries-long use of poison pesticides have damaged the plants. And so the genetic engineers invent a non-toxic pesticide substitute called MCGX. It's non-toxic. They're certain it's safe for humans and plants as well. But then something unexpected and unintended happens, and the consequences are huge and devastating. So while ecospasm involves unintended consequences of genetic engineering, it's much broader than that. It's about unintended consequences more generally. And I want to give you a couple of examples. One in my own experience, sort of. I had a postdoctoral fellowship at National Cancer Institute, and I was working in cell biology. What we were doing was we were growing cancer cells in a petri dish, and we were using radioactive isotopes of iodine in the process. And so the nutrients in the petri dish were radioactive. And I was concerned. We had to be very careful with that stuff. We took iodine pills for safety, and I was, I began to wonder what might go wrong. Fortunately, nothing did. But about 4 years later, I attended a very large meeting in Washington, D.C., and the meeting was there to discuss a proposal. And the proposal was whether or not a biology lab, and I think it was a military lab, should start producing dangerous viruses and deadly pathogens in the lab. And I had remembered my concerns just about radioactive iodine. So by the way, there was an audience of hundreds of people, and there was a panel of experts on stage. So I took the microphone and I started talking about my concerns, and I got shouted down. I didn't know what hit me. I was really very naive in those days, and I just clammed up. But one of the experts on stage immediately came to my rescue, and I remember he was kind of a slim fellow with red hair, and he was a PhD biology professor from Harvard University. And he said, no, let me tell you this story. There was a biology lab that was growing cells in radioactive culture medium, just like I had been doing, right? The technician put the Petri dish with the radioactive cells and medium into a locked cabinet for the night. Unfortunately, he forgot to put the top on the Petri dish, so it was open. And some ants discovered the Petri dish and started feasting on the nutrients and became radioactive and traipsed around the entire laboratory and contaminated the entire laboratory. So there's an example of unintended consequences. There's one. A second one, I'll make this very quick, but believe it or not, in the late 1960s, we almost dropped a live hydrogen bomb over our own country in Goldsboro, North Carolina. It's a story that only came out recently from Freedom of Information request. But the gist of the story is that a B-52 bomber carrying two hydrogen bombs disintegrated in midair, and the bombs dropped. Apparently, one of them fell harmlessly to the earth. The other one didn't. The parachute opened just as it would if it were a weapon, and a switch, fortunately, stopped the bomb from going off. There was one switch that went off, and they were concerned that switch could have been damaged by a lightning bolt. Well, it turns out later, further investigation into that story showed that the switch actually failed. The hydrogen bomb would have blown up over North Carolina, except there was a second switch. And that second switch also was vulnerable to a lightning bolt. So there's another case of unintended consequences. And the third one I want to mention is just that somewhere, I'm going to be very careful what I say here, but according to the stories on Google News, and I have to be careful about that, there is a professor somewhere in the United States who has developed a version of the 2009 avian flu that is a pandemic virus. In a laboratory, he created it, and if it ever got out, it would kill 1 billion people. There's no vaccine for it. So those kinds of things are going on, and people seem to ignore the unintended consequences of what they're doing at times, and which I think is awful.
So we also have that history of doing that. I remember when I was studying for my master's on cottonseed oil, for example, and I had to call various agricultural departments in various states across the country. I was appalled to learn that while we have the science that something is detrimental, we do it anyway. I don't understand where the integrity is or why we're not careful with consequences, and that goes back to respecting the planet and respecting all species, not just the human species, but all species on the planet. We had developed pesticides that ended up becoming pesticides, which is killing fish, and when they wanted to kill a particular fish in a pond, they ended up killing everything else, so that the pond was effectively sterile and nothing could live in it. So unfortunately, we seem to learn by error and trial rather than playing it forward to see if it's really safe or if it makes sense from an ethical, moral point of view. So those stories are very sobering, let's put it that way. Bob, you have another theme in Ecospasm. What do you feel about a superintelligence in nature, in plants, in us? And I find the question of free will to be a very intriguing one.
I think it is, too. I just come back to what you were just saying, by the way, the examples you gave very quickly. And I want to say this because it's important. So, Ecospasm is not anti-science or anti-genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is starting to become effective in treating or helping to cure cancer and other incurable diseases. It's just that we have to be very careful of the unintended consequences of it. So the third theme, is there a kind of superintelligence in nature and plants and in us? And if there is, do we really have free will? And I raise those issues in the story. There's a dialogue between the protagonist, who's a Western scientist who has a serious interest in meditation, but he's really a Western, and he firmly believes in human free will. And he has a dialogue with an Eastern mystic who believes there's an overriding superintelligence called the ninth consciousness. And that ninth consciousness, the overriding superintelligence in all of life, values harmony among living things and is calling the shots. In other words, has the ultimate free will. And I raise these questions. I don't try to definitively. I don't presume to definitively answer them. I don't pretend to have an answer. It's a very complex subject, and these are age-old questions. But if anyone's interested, there's a whole chapter in there in that dialogue, and it explores that to some depth.
I found that fascinating from a reader point of view to bring in that the opposite, so to speak, and have some kind of a dialogue about it. I thought that was a very good writing technique to developing the story and moving the story forward. So you have a science background. What prompted you or sparked you to write the sci-fi book on this kind of topic?
That's kind of funny in a way, because the idea for the story came suddenly, literally decades ago. It's almost embarrassing to say this. But it was in a question and answer that I just popped into my mind. And the question that popped into my head was, what would happen if plants stopped producing photosynthesis and therefore ceased producing sugar and other nutrients? And I knew the answer. All animals, including humans, would cease to exist. And that's because animals can't produce their own food. Only plants can produce food, which animals must eat to form the bottom of our food chain, or else we'll all die. So I wrote a few chapters of the story, and then I realized I had no idea where the story was going. And I put it away for years because I was really focusing my attention and launching my university teaching career. As far as my science, and I picked it up later, obviously. I picked up the story years later. As far as the science background, so I have a BS in physiks from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and a master's and PhD in theoretical physics from the George Washington University. And while I was in graduate school, I was also working in U.S. government laboratories. So I have about 10 years of research there in U.S. government laboratories. And then I had mentioned that postdoctoral research fellowship in biophysics and cell biology at the National Cancer Institute. So that's my background.
Well, so the GMO has been a very hot topic, and you played that forward in the possible consequences. Can you give the reader briefly some good science?
Well, what we think of as GMOs, mostly we think of the word Monsanto and Roundup. It's much broader than that. GMO stands for genetically modified organism, and it can be anything. And in ecospasm, there's a question of whether human beings themselves will become the ultimate genetically modified organism, whether we ourselves will become genetically modified. But when you think of it as GMO foods, we go to Whole Foods and places like that. So anyway, controlling weeds has always been a big challenge for food crop farmers. I'm a vegetable gardener. I'm not a farmer, but even with a half-acre vegetable garden, the weeds are incredibly difficult to deal with. So in 1974, the Monsanto company introduced its powerful herbicide, aka weed killer, called Roundup, which we're all familiar with. And it was very good at killing weeds. And then about 2 decades later, in 1996, they introduced what they call Roundup-ready seeds. Those seeds were genetically engineered to tolerate the Roundup herbicide. In other words, you could spray these plants with these genetically modified seeds. You could spray them with this incredibly strong herbicide, and nothing would happen. They'd survive it. Well, that's great if you're a farmer, because if you grow crops now, food crops with these genetically modified seeds, which came to be known as genetically modified organisms, GMOs, you can plant these crops with these seeds and then spray the crops with Roundup, and what happens is all the weeds get killed and the food crops survive. It's a brilliant system. But it had unintended consequences. Roundup appears to cause cancer and birth defects and all kinds of terrible things among the workers in the farms. So one question about GMO foods that we kind of wonder about: are they safe to eat? It's debatable. The National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, in a May 2016 report, they produced a major report on GMOs in May of 2016. It's a very long report, but the apparent takeaway, according to newspaper editorials, is that the GMOs are safe for human consumption. That's what the newspaper editorials declared. I remember that. So a little later in 2016, in December, the New York Times had an article about the National Academy of Sciences in Engineering and Medicine about a different issue they were addressing, which is biotechnology. And there are panels that advise the entire academy. There's about a panel of half a dozen or a dozen people, maybe a dozen people, that look into the research and come to their conclusions about it. And the New York Times posted a story in December 2016, there's a quote about it that the panel is rife with conflicts of interest, and they name the panel members and they elucidate what kind of conflicts they have. Now, the GMO report was issued by a different panel, but it does make you wonder. I mean, if some of these panel members have conflicts within the very industry that they're advising about or supposedly being objective about, it makes you wonder. I don't know any longer whether I can trust those editorials that say that GMOs are safe. So the jury's out for me.
Well, I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, I don't know if you've heard of Ocean Robbins, but he and his father, who's John Robbins of the Baskin and Robbins fame, they conducted a GMO summit, which I took part in. And if anybody's interested, you can go to my blog on my website, judithdryer.com, and you can look up a very practical explanation of what the GMO actually is and what it isn't, just to expand on your topic. But go ahead, Bob.
Well, genetically modified organisms more broadly are very hot topics. Do we want genetically modified children? Back in 2003, I believe it was, Bill McKibben, who's a very well-known environmentalist, wrote a book called Enough, and he was explaining the unintended consequences of having designer kids and designer children. And that's come very close to starting to happen now. There's been taboos against it. The taboos are falling down. There's a new genetic engineering technique called CRISPR, which makes genetic engineering and changing of DNA far, far easier than ever it was. So it's a very serious issue of what's going to be the future of the human species, what kind of world we're going to live in. So.
It is, because as you mentioned before, I think you shared with me, just from an unintended consequence point of view, cell phones are great, but we didn't realize an unintended consequence of amazing deaths from traffic accidents because people are busy on their phones. So it raises a lot of questions. Are we prepared for the future? Have we thought about the future? What's our moral and ethical obligation to the future with these scientific advancements?
Let me put it in humorous terms. Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong and at the worst possible time. And then someone once said Murphy was an optimist. So
That's funny. That's funny.
This is not to be a naysayer. It's not to be negative. It's to be careful.
Exactly. So if we're going to connect the dots here with the various points that you've made and your interest and curiosity in writing a story about a possibility, which concept under the holistic framework do you feel your book responds to the most, or you personally respond to the most?
Yeah, the thing that I really dig into in my own thinking is the idea inherent in all things, in humans, in nature, in the universe itself, that everything has a light side that enhances life and a dark side that damages or destroys life. For example, just think of a gentle breeze in the springtime, and it travels through the petals of a flower and disturbs the pollen. The pollen goes on the breeze, and then the pollen reaches another flower. And what is that doing? It's to create the next generation of flowers. It enhances life. It generates life. So the breeze, the wind, is part of nature's way of procreating life. But take that same physical property, the wind, and ramp the speed up to tornado speeds, and it destroys everything in its path. And I think everything in life has that light side and that dark side. Genetic engineering in medicine promises miraculous cures of diseases, but in the hands of some people who insist on creating pandemic viruses in the laboratory, as I mentioned before, it could also wipe out billions of people. The Buddhists speak of enlightenment within us as well as the darkness innate in human life. And in that that's way of thinking. For us humans, our battle is to enhance our enlightened energies and diminish our darkness energy, or transform the darkness to create value through an inner revolution. It's called human revolution. And even Carl Jung talked about the shadow side of the human psyche. And what's not good is to repress the shadow. That leads to neurosis. And in psychology, and what's not good is to deny the shadow, to deny the dark side. It's not to dwell on it. Again, it's not to be a pessimist. But it's also not good to just blithely go along and say nothing can go wrong, because things do. So that's the concept that most animates me, this whole idea of the light and the dark as a fundamental entity of the universe itself.
Well, I think those are good points to make. We could talk about that for the next 3 days, because those are topics near to my heart. Yes, and there's such great authors and writers out there who are working in the field of personal transformation. Carolyn Mace, for example, happens to be my top go-to person for understanding the shadow, the light, and how to integrate my own shadow and light side. It's all about integration. It's all about understanding who and what we are. And when we do that, I think we're better human beings, number one. And I think we realize our interconnectedness, number two. And it brings forth a different sense of compassion. And that's what I hope to do with some of these podcasts, is to inspire people to rethink especially their relationship to nature, for example. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about before we conclude?
I just want to reiterate a few things. Well, first I want to reiterate what I said about people, about how people tick, how we all tick. And again, some people can be convinced by facts and documentaries and reason, and I'll say it again, but other folks cannot be persuaded by those methods. They just resist letting the facts in. I guess that's what it is. But they may be moved by direct appeal to their emotions through drama and fiction, and that's what I hope. That's one of my goals in promoting Ecospasm as a dramatic sci-fi thriller of unintended consequences, as a novel and hopefully as a movie that may motivate some of those people who have resisted documentaries and resisted facts to reconsider the consequences, intended and unintended, of the choices. It's the choices we make and the actions we take in our relationship with the natural world. And I want to emphasize again on which we depend for our survival as a species. I'd also, I guess if there's time, I'd like to read a few excerpts. There is a Nobel Prize-winning environmentalist by the name of Eric Chivian. He read the book and he did a review of it, and he kind of supports some of the themes that I've been talking about. And so I want to quickly just read a few excerpts, frankly, of it. And he says, first of all, he comes up with his own examples of unintended consequences I hadn't thought of. For instance, X-rays. I didn't know this, but we used to use X-rays to X-ray people's feet when they were in a shoe store before we realized that they were dangerous. And he goes on to other examples. But he said in Ecospasm, this is a shameless plug, but he captures it so well. He says in Ecospasm, Robert Radin has well captured this dual aspect of scientific innovation, both its great promise and its unintended consequences. He has produced a page-turner that issues a warning about our increased reliance on genetically modified GM food crops and on the pesticides on which these crops depend. Though he is a theoretical physicist, Dr. Radin is clearly well informed about the complex interdependence of our planet's plants, animals, and microbes, and about how we human beings are an integral, intimate part of these living systems. Ecospasm provides a lesson that we ignore at our peril, that by our ever-increasing reliance on GM crops, which are now planted on some 170 million acres in the United States, almost half of all U.S. farmland, and by our ever-increasing reliance on the mixture of herbicides and insecticides and fungicides applied to these crops, we are, in essence, performing an experiment on the living world, including on ourselves, an experiment for which we have little to no data about potential consequences, an experiment for which we have not given our informed consent. The result, as Dr. Radin warns, could end up being catastrophic, and he closes by saying, I recommend this highly engaging and thought-provoking thriller to all. And he's founder and Eric Chivian, MD, founder and director, Center for Health and the Global Environment, Harvard Medical School. So I think he captured it very well.
Oh, I think he did too. Bob, where can the readers get your book?
So it's available for purchase on Amazon. And the nice thing about Amazon is that they provide a few sample chapters, a few sample selections, but they're first few chapters, so you can read it for free online and see if it interests you. There's also some information available on my website. So my website address is I'll spell it, www.robertradin.com. And I'm currently working on to revise a screenplay for Ecospasm, so I am looking, obviously, for a producer and for an agent for that. So thank you very much, Judith.
Oh, you are welcome. I'm so grateful that you could join us today. I know I was intrigued by the book. It is a page-turner, I will tell you that. And I can't be a spoiler about how it ends. But I hope you feel as inspired as I do by Bob's practical talk and practical advice, but also what's behind a work of fiction, a sci-fi thriller fiction that actually can have some connection to thinking about what kind of future we want. And that's intrigued me for bringing Bob on to the holistic nature of us. So I'm going to say thank you, Bob, and I'm going to conclude this podcast. Again, this is Judith Dreyer, author of the book At the Garden's Gate, book and blog. And my book, At the Garden's Gate, is available through my website, which is www.judithdreyer.com, or it's available on Amazon, Nook, Kobe, Indigo, as well as through the Ingram Distribution Network. Visit my website for a replay of this podcast, and of course, all reviews are welcome. So thank you again, folks, and have a great day.